Well, thanks for joining us today at the virtual Qualys Risk Summit. My name is Jonathan Trull. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer for Qualys, and I'm the host for today's Fireside Chats, How CISOs Can Navigate the Changing Landscape of Cybersecurity. And I am so thrilled to be joined today by Rinki Sethi. She is a CISO at Bill, former CISO for Twitter, and is a member on several boards and advisor to many other companies, and just has a ton of real world practical experience. So welcome. It is so nice to have you with us.
Thanks for having me. Excited about the conversation.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, let's jump into it. We've got some topics that we know a lot of our customers and those that will be attending the summit are really interested in. And I think one of those is really about the role of the CISO and has it changed? Is it evolving? And obviously, as the name of our summit applies, it's all about risk today. We're talking about risk, and specifically risk as it relates to cyber threats. And I know when I have conversations with boards and my executive leadership, the idea of what my role is today has changed compared to when I had a similar role 10 years ago. And I think I'm getting responsibilities around things that in the past would not have fallen within my team's responsibility. So, I guess I would love, Rinki, from your perspective, have you experienced something similar in your career? Is the role of the CISO evolving? Has it stayed the same for you? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. And now spending almost having spent 2 decades in cybersecurity, which is where I started my career, I remember security being the grassroots kind of team, and nobody knew it was this team of maybe hackers. I'm not really sure what they do. When you talked about externally to your family, nobody knew what cybersecurity was. And now you hear about it in conversation outside of the workplace every single day, right? Cybersecurity, people have heard about breaches. They understand the just the significant impact of it. And so it's just been such a massive transformation over the last few decades. And when I think about the role of a CISO, there were no CISOs outside of banks when you think about this just 20 years ago, which is not a long time ago. And now almost every public company has a CISO. Most startups have CISOs pretty early on, and they know that thinking about security early on is really going to be a competitive advantage, regardless of what kind of business you're in. And so it's been a very interesting change all the way to, I think, how boards are, even some of the mandates that are coming from the SEC and regulatory requirements around cybersecurity, and how boards are now going to require cybersecurity expertise. And so you think about CISOs that weren't existent, and now we're all presenting to the board quarterly, if not more frequently. Boards have cybersecurity expertise. There's an expectation around that. It's no longer just this technical role, but it's an art and science mixed together, where you really have to navigate the business at every single layer. And it's just become such a fascinating space and massive transformation, as I said, over the last few decades.
Yeah, and I remember again, and I think CISOs and the security community have been clamoring for a seat at the table, right? To become a true C-level. And I think my experience is, in the last couple of years, that's happened in most cases, right? Like again, publicly traded organizations, even some of the larger private companies. I think CISOs are being held accountable for protecting their organizations around topics like business resilience and ensuring that there's high availability, and obviously the stakes couldn't be higher, right? As we look at kind of the expectations and the requirements that are being put on. I would say personally, I think that CISOs actually do have a very significant seat at the table today. And again, like you said, 10 years ago, I was an IT group, right? It was a small group within IT. They did some things that who knows what it was. Was it helpful for the business or not? Maybe, but we had no context. But now, I mean, I'm amazed at the interaction I have, across our C-suite, across with our board of directors. I really think the role has evolved in a tremendous way.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah, it's no longer just a a small group that's running grassroots. It's kind of conversations all the way from top down.
Yeah, that's great. And the other thing I think that we talk about evolution, but just the difficulty of the role, right? And I think, I hear a lot about from my colleagues about, CISO burnout and the stress, I think, added with that level. And I do think, a lot of that is coming from this evolving threat landscape, and if we look over the last few years, we've seen just these huge societal changes that impacted people personally and businesses, COVID and the pandemic and having the businesses keep running and everyone at home, these massive supply chain issues where you're trying to get equipment and again, keep technology operating. In some cases, for those of us that operate in Europe and the war in Ukraine and Russia, created challenges for us, potentially some new threats that we're facing. And then we've seen, these banking crises just this year that have hit us and some financial uncertainty. And then the other part that I was thinking about a lot is, Log4j, I think, showed us an example of just how intertwined and interconnected our software supply chain is. You have, a library or a Java class that seems pretty benign and is used everywhere. And, suddenly, your day changes overnight, because you're trying to really scramble with what was a known good piece of software at the time. And then I now know on my side, where I'm not a big fan of marketing names and throw in, AI and everything. But listen, I'm getting a lot of requests to evaluate, hey, can we use ChatGPT? Is it safe? What terms and licenses do we have to be concerned about? What does this mean to our business? And these are all risks that are complicated and difficult to get your arms around. So, I guess with that as a backdrop, how do you see the risk evolving? What has it changed, where you're spending your time or are you seeing new priorities that you really have to spend your time, money, and your team on?
Yeah, Jonathan, you stressed me out with all those things. But I think you're spot on. It's one, there's new threats that have emerged. Two, we've gone through a lot in the last few years, including the pandemic and some of the things we've seen around the globe. And then there's just this much more awareness around this topic, right? So there's pressures coming from your executives and boards around how do you think about this? What should we be doing? And we saw this bank crisis, and it's just been unprecedented times. And I remember when the pandemic hit, as an example, it's like companies were already struggling with cybersecurity, and not everybody has access to the practitioners that they may want or need. And all of a sudden, companies are having to overnight think about, we need to operate in cloud. We've always been a data center company, and we need to now think of a hybrid environment. And the pandemic pushed them to start thinking about that. And like, we don't have cloud expertise. Are we going to get cloud security expertise in-house? Are we going to build some of these capabilities? And we have all these legacy issues we're dealing with. And so I remember talking to CISOs and even other companies that didn't have them, and they're just struggling with, how do we wrap our arms around this? And definitely the threat landscape has evolved, especially because technology has evolved. Like now AI has been one of the top things I'm getting. Other CISOs are asking, hey, what's your AI policy? Are you allowing, your company to use it? Are you not allowing? And it's all over the place, right? On how folks are thinking about this, how risk averse or how much of an appetite for risk you may have at the company. But then in many ways, our profession still remains the same, right? That we have always had to tackle all these risks, and the threat landscape is always evolving and it's always changing, which is what makes this field so fascinating and so cool to work in, but also super challenging. And I think, and I know we're going to talk about this, but how you navigate, what does the threat landscape look like? How are we prioritizing our risks? And then how do we drive down risk ownership across the company based on all those factors? I think is where it becomes very interesting. But it is an ever-changing space. We're always, I know, like folks like you and I, we have to stay on top of it. And what's our point of view on things, and kind of just be on it constantly. And there's the proactive and reactive nature of what we do.
Yeah, that's great. And you called out, I think, maybe the one risk that I think about all the time, which is just talent, right? And again, I think, we're all looking for the best talent. We want to retain the best talent, and there is a shortage of those. And again, the more specialized the skill set, those that know how to, break and tear apart C code and, really dig into the details of, very specific types of technology are extremely hard to find, extremely hard to retain. And, I guess in your mind, we've seen some tech layoffs here recently. Is that a good thing? Do you feel like maybe there's going to be some more cybersecurity talent for CISOs to go after and onboard, or is that creating more problems for you?
I think that it's interesting what the layoffs has created and what I'm hearing too from others, which is one, I think most of the folks have found roles pretty quickly. There's a huge, although the layoffs are happening, there's in cybersecurity, there's so many job openings still. It's still a field hungry for folks, and so and we don't have enough. And so I think that that's one aspect of it. The other is I think because the layoffs have happened, it's started creating this kind of a larger risk around insider threat, right? And you're hearing a lot of things that as employees are nervous, this kind of thing that CISOs had. Yeah, insider threat is definitely a worry to now. It might be one of the top risks they're thinking about, that when people get nervous and they're, it's not the best place when that's what the market is like, that's when mistakes happen, accidents happen, and you have more insider threat. And then I think third, and this is what I've always said, I think we've got to start thinking of ways of bringing more talent into cybersecurity. We can't just rely on the small pool we have, and just stealing from each other as companies. We've got to really invest in kind of that next generation of talent, whether that's at a very early age at the high school, elementary school levels, on how do we expose them to cybersecurity so that we get more talent in. So hopefully that it's not that, oh, this person got laid off and I'm just going to take them out. Now I've got somebody extra on my team, but looking beyond that for that specific risk around talent, talent retention and talent attrition. So, I do think this market creates interesting risks for cybersecurity teams. I mean, the hardest part, I think, for many CISOs that I've talked to is we're having to cut really critical programs. And how can I stay in this role feeling good about things, knowing that that's a table stake? And I think that's heartbreaking, hearing some of that's happening. And I hope that we're not in this state for too long.
Yeah. And that's a great segue into our next topic, which is, when you think about, and again, I kind of have my mental model about how I develop a strategy. And obviously the focus is driving down, kind of the residual cyber risks that we have as a company to an acceptable level, right? That we've agreed to as a leadership team, as our board has discussed. But kind of two of the main components that I think about at a very macro level is attack surface. And again, when I think attack surface, it's really across the entire organization. I'm constantly thinking, what is the path of attack, whether that's against a user, whether that's going after, an AD admin, whether that's something exposed to the internet, that's really kind of table stakes. But I really use kind of the attack surface model as I start thinking about my organization and business processes and where I really feel like we need to move the needle forward for driving down risk. And then the other one is posture management. And for me, that's conformity of configurations. That's making sure that we're updating software, that there's no end of life and things that we can't patch or deal with. But I'm always constantly trying to take those two aspects in any given day and every interaction that I have, and that's just one of the models that I'm using, to fit in. I mean, how do you think about it? When you're going about your strategy and you're going about your day, and like you said, unfortunately for many people, they're having a budget that's cut potentially, and so they're having to make tough decisions. How do you think about that? What are your mental models that you can share with others?
Yeah, I mean, whether we present to the execs or the boards or to different teams we're trying to influence, we're always looking for data, right? And I have all the risk diagrams, right? That'll show risk is going up in this area, risk has gone down in this area. Here's the trending over time. Here's our vulnerability data. But I totally agree with you on the attack surface model. And one of the things I rely on, there's like this gut feeling we have because we've been working in this space for so long, right? That you know that this is kind of the stuff I really worry about. But how do I articulate that? Because it's not just these risk, it's not just the risk and the data that we're showing. And I think the red team attacks, right, to validate some of our assumptions or those gut feelings that we have, to say, let's do a red team and see what we can do. And I think that exposes, not only validates the data you have, like, hey, look, we had this vulnerability that was past SLA that we were able to exploit, and now all of a sudden it becomes a super important data point that's driven by something that you know is your attack surface. And not only that, it's also shows kind of, well, as you're going down that red team attack, what was your detection and what were your response, and were you able to catch some of these things by your operations team being able to detect the attack as it was happening? So you know that, hey, okay, at least I'm good on the defense side. Now we've got to do more on the prevention side and maybe some of these areas. And I think it's stitching all of that together, right? So as we're looking at the risk and the data and some of the things we just have to report on, and is the responsible thing to do. I think it's also saying that doesn't tell the whole story. Let me tell you now some of these other things we're doing, and that kind of stitches that story together. And I can't, that's I think where the impact is driven. That's where you can influence and kind of get moving in the right direction. And that's how I also think about it. I think that attack surface piece is super important.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's great. And I think, one of the, and you talk about like bringing up your team and giving your team more exposure to, I have a lot of team members that want to become a CISO, right? And, they're thinking about what does it take? And I think you really call out, right? Like the idea that experience and, while it feels gut level, it's driven by, right, 20 years of experience and dealing with attacks and issues. And it really is so important, I think, to inform, right, your strategy. And I try to do it. I'm not always great at it, but at the end of a really busy day, the noise of emails and chats coming in and meetings all day, I'm always trying to reflect back and just say, what is my gut telling me, right? Based on what we've done today, do we move the needle forward? Is there an area that we need to address? And sometimes that's hard to articulate to a board, and right, you have to apply that more into maybe KPIs, key risk indicators. But when I think about like even what boards are facing, right, you see, the new SEC reporting requirements that are like, imminently coming out. Some of the presidential requirements where we're seeing software bill of materials being required in certain things, to really getting, at the depth of, the core of your infrastructure and the products that you provide. And there's just a ton of demand on the boards as well, right? Where they're feeling, the heat to really understand security, to really feel good, that it's being managed properly. I guess, what's your advice, right? Like, when you're obviously presenting to board members who may not be security experts, but they're definitely business savvy. And some, you will have security experts. So how are you balancing that? Like, how are you, discussing risk, or what would be your advice in doing it well?
Yeah, I think as I talk to board members, and I have a few points of view, right? Because I also sit on a couple boards as a CISO, bringing different perspectives, right? And so I'm not just a peer to the CISO that is in that company, but also can think about, hey, how are you thinking about the product, and kind of ask a different set of questions from a board standpoint, which then also informs the rest of the board on cybersecurity. But on the flip side, as a CISO, I think it's really important to treat board members as kind of a sounding board almost. And it's an opportunity. I have the relationships outside the boardroom with board members too, right? Where you chat with them and you say, here's what I'm going to be presenting. And that's when you get to say, well, hopefully they're asking the questions. Otherwise, you can kind of inform them, hey, you should be asking me what keeps me up at night. That's not on those slides, right? And let's have that dialogue. And here's how I think about risk, and thinking about risk and getting alignment around how they think about risk, how you think about it from a business perspective as well as a security perspective, and then making sure that's kind of top of the board mind. And of course, I think one of the newer things that you're starting to see is these cybersecurity committees forming, and advisory boards that have tech folks and CISOs as a part of that, two companies, which I think is really healthy too, to inform the board that there's kind of a diverse perspective on how you're dealing with security, or at least the CISO and related folks. have a sounding board on this stuff. And that's kind of been my advice is as I think about this. Because I think there's a lot of frameworks we can use for board presentations and for executives. But at the end of the day, I think it's how do you influence, how do you drive change? Does the board understand the impact, right? Not just the metrics and the red, yellow, green, but are you talking about like if this happens, how is it going to impact our business? And do we all understand that? Do we have common language around that?
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think the common language is such an essential piece of it, because I think what I've learned is everyone thinks about risk slightly differently and have different expectations about what is acceptable levels of risk too, and how do I feel about that? You have people that are more naturally risk takers in certain environments, and in other cases they're not. And I think really trying to level set is so important. And I know, from a lot of the boards that I interact with, I am seeing a lot more push for metrics and more data driven. I think early in my career it was a lot of heat maps, which I think are valuable, and now we're starting to see more push for some defined, measurable type of leading indicators of where your risk is. And I think that's a very interesting evolution, right? Are you seeing the same? Are people trying to quantify like the financial impact of your controls, or is that still kind of only the 1% that are trying to get there? Where are you seeing that from kind of a maturity perspective for reporting?
You know, it's interesting from a reporting perspective. I haven't really seen it myself. I've been part of an organization where we used to do that, where we used to put kind of what is the financial impact of some of these risks. Um, and like I don't know how valuable that is, to be honest with you. I actually think it's in some ways something really small. I mean, we've heard about now incidents, right, at other companies where you wouldn't have expected it to be that massive of a case, but the news around and the press around it impacted the company. They face fines and all this other things that have happened. And I think again, it's really, do you have the right process? It's asking those questions. Do you have the right processes? Do we understand if this becomes a public incident or a crisis? How are you going to handle it? Do we have the ways to handle it? How may it impact our costs? What might be the impact to the company? We've done some of that like high level, not because of requirements, but more kind of what do we think it's going to be? But I think the discussions around it and what is our appetite to, it depends from brand to brand as well. And so what is our appetite to accept some of this? And is it about the money? Is it about the trust loss or customers that we may lose? And I think thinking about all of that, and all of us as security practitioners, we have some of this documentation, right, through our impact analysis and all of that. And I think it's, but more important to have, I see like, you have your GRC teams that do all this technical risk analysis and you have every data point, and then there's complete misalignment with the execs and the board, or it's never been talked about. And you're like, was it more important to do that? Or is it more important to get alignment around that? Again, what we talked about, the common language and the risk framework you're using, and what's our appetite around this? What kind of company are we? What do we do in these cases? And if you have alignment there, I think then you can, I think that is more important than having those exact kind of like money related metrics associated with the risks.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, and I would say, for at least for me, some of the best, no metrics aside, put all that, but doing, like live tabletop exercises with executives, right? And walking through scenarios and, reaching that common, like, is this, acceptable? What we said just occurred, right? Oh, and again, because everyone's language, I think, is different around risk, really making some of these scenario and what if situations really starts to bring out more how people truly feel about risk. And again, of course, hopefully that leads into, budget decisions and the staffing and like, oh, if that's not acceptable, then here's what it's going to take, to ensure that that doesn't happen, or at least it's highly unlikely that event would happen. And you brought something else up to mind that I think, I'd love to get your thoughts on, and at least I'm experiencing it. And that's the idea of like audit and compliance fatigue on security teams. And again, like, I feel like I'm audited by everyone right now. Like all of our customers want to audit me. I have to do my SOC 2 audit, my ISO certification. Someone's going to want to send me, a supplier, third-party risk management, or sign up for some new portal. And And one of the things that I keep thinking, I'm like, I feel like some way we've almost failed as an industry to get alignment on how we report, controls and get agreement on that. I think SOC 2 and some of that was hopefully going to do it, but honestly, in my experience over the past couple of years, it's just gotten worse and worse, right? Like I think the pressure on companies, to manage, third party risk is increasing. And I know I'm feeling, kind of that fatigue and that workload of being audited 365 every day. I mean, are you seeing the same, or any advice to anyone who's trying to get their arms around that, I guess?
Yeah, it's everybody, right? It's like I felt goosebumps when you were talking about that because yes, we all feel it. We all feel it. It's like super painful. And I do agree with you. I think we have failed as an industry in some ways, and we're spending so much effort, right, on the audit side that it takes away from securing the business. And we're not fooling anybody it's not audits don't necessarily it's not, I always say compliance doesn't equal security. I think if you get security right, you'll fill your compliance requirements, but that's what the focus should be. And I think some of the things that there's areas where I've seen that you can push back. You can push back on some of these contracts, I think, or say that if I do the following things, then it should fulfill or even go beyond the needs of what you're asking for in an audit, or have the folks that are asking for audits to make sure that they're funding them as well and building that into the contract language. But I think beyond that, I think there's times where it's you have to take a look at the program and say, like, maybe we need to invest in automation. Have we built security in early on and automations in such a way that these audits become easier? I have also seen that I think they're trying, like banks are trying to consolidate into, I forgot what the name of it was, but there's a portal. They're like, and they're saying, okay, 80% of the questions that we're going to ask are, going to come from that. So it's like kind of taking away a little bit of the burden, but we have such a long way to go on that front. But I think it's again a conversation with the business on what business is this going to drive us? Can we pause on some of the audits? What's the impact of that? And can we focus more on getting this part right, which will actually save money in the long term and be faster when you're doing the audits if you've got that built in.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, I've been putting a lot of thought in that, and it's just as I've been in the industry now for a little bit, if there's one area, where I just really want to try to dig in and kind of help with the industry. And again, it's not that I mind audits. It's just, we all have different questions and we all have different requirements. And again, it's so funny if we can, as an industry, even reach kind of agreement on what are the critical controls that we want someone to comply with. I mean, geez, how on earth are we going to expect board members and others to kind of understand this space? And so, while I think we've made tremendous progress, it's just one of those where it's like, oh, there's still work to be done, right? There's still good work to be done by the industry. And I know as we're getting close to our time, I'd love to wrap up and if you could share a little bit about, like, if you want to get into the industry or become a CISO. I've got two young girls who I'm trying to convince this is a great career and it's super cool. And they're like, oh, Dad, I see kind of what you do. I'm not sure you're convincing me. I don't know. What advice do you have for people that want to get into cybersecurity or want to become a CISO, from your perspective?
Yeah, I think one, I think we have as security practitioners have an obligation to give back and I think raise awareness. We're not going to fill the gaps in this space, like the pains we're feeling. We need diverse perspectives and we need to bring in new talent. Like, go and create high school. I think like junior high school is when kids start deciding who they are and what they're interested in. Create shadowing programs, because they're not, maybe it's harder to create internship programs. I know I'm gonna have my kids come to work and shadow and see kind of some parts of security in other areas of the business, but I think it's really important. Like, we need to invest more in younger folks getting an interest and even getting exposed to this and kind of breaking some of those stereotypes of what it is we do. Like I remember telling my daughter, just because you love speech and debate doesn't mean you should go become a lawyer. There's a lot of communications involved in cybersecurity. It's what I do every day. And so I think that's breaking some of the stereotypes of what we do, and that there's a role for folks with all kinds of mindsets and backgrounds to have a role in this. For those that are aspiring to be a CISO, we need you. I think there's so many, like so many great people out there, and we're all open. We want more CISOs and more diversity in this space, and we're more than happy to mentor and talk and help get folks there, make recommendations. Sometimes I think it's just saying, I want that role. And there's companies of different sizes that are looking for folks with different backgrounds and different, years of experience and so forth. And I think it's just knowing that and putting it out there that that's what you want to do. There's a lot of mentors. I know now, like, little forums that are forming where people are even putting out classes and things like that on getting folks ready to be a CISO. So there's a lot of opportunity. I hope that folks do pursue this field, and I hope to see an area of passion for me personally to get more girls into cybersecurity and in technology in general. The Girl Scouts have an amazing badge program, cybersecurity badge program. They have a really good curriculum for kindergarten through 12th. I've heard now some of the kids that earned all those badges are pursuing careers in cybersecurity, which is amazing to see. And so I think there is a lot out there. We just have to kind of help drive it as industry leaders as well.
Yeah, thanks for your passion in that. And yeah, I think there are so many great new programs coming out, at the middle school level, right? And Girl Scouts, and I've heard of others like 4-H and other organizations that I would have never thought of, that are exposing kids early, to what does it mean, to work in cybersecurity? Because I think many of them have different I guess expectations of what that is. And the good news is I think we're going to see in the next 5 years a lot of those pay off, I hope, and thanks for your contribution to that. It's really great. Well, listen, it's been an amazing conversation. Your experience and wisdom goes such a far way for both myself and our audience. So thank you so much for joining us, and we'll have to have you back soon.
I look forward to it. Thank you for having me.